Schönen guten Abend zum heutigen Vortrag von Tom Avermaete. Die Einladung an ihn steht im Zusammenhang mit dem Inhalt der Ausstellung von Walter Niedermeyer, der auch heute da ist, weil das Fleimstal ja eigentlich eine fast 1000-jährige Commons-Geschichte hat. Falls Sie es nicht wissen, aber das Fleimstal hat 1111 sich ein Recht ausbedungen, dass das gesamte Gebiet dieser 11 Gemeinden, wo eine Gemeinde latinisch ist, eine deutschsprachig und 9 Gemeinden italienischsprachig sind, das gesamte Gemeindegebiet, also Berge, Wälder, Almen, Wiesen, gemeinsam verwalten. Das heißt, das Eigentum gehört allen, also das gesamte Gebiet ist im Eigentum von allen Bewohnern des Fleimstales. Und in der Vergangenheit bis, sage ich jetzt mal, ins 19. Jahrhundert war es auch so, dass der Ertrag, der aus dieser landwirtschaftlichen Wirtschaft erarbeitet wurde, dann jedem Einwohner, oder besser gesagt, das Fleimstal war in Herde organisiert, wenn am Ende des Jahres der Gewinn von diesem Agrar und vor allem Wald wurde dann mit Geld an die einzelnen Herde ausgezahlt und auch Holzgeld gegeben. Das heißt, es ist auch mit Holz zurückgezahlt worden und deswegen ist auch diese räumliche Struktur und die Flächen oder die Raumstrukturen dieser Gemeinden sehr speziell geworden. Und das war genau das Interesse von Walter Niedermeyer und es freut mich, dass heute Tom Avermaete hier ist. Er ist in Antwerpen geboren, hat dann in Antwerpen, Kopenhagen und Leuven studiert, ist seit 2013 auch Professor in Delft und war ein Jahr in Wien auf der Akademie der Bildenden Künste. So ist auch indirekt dann der Kontakt entstanden. Ich muss Sie heute entschuldigen, die Kathi Aste ist in Venedig, aber sie hat den Kontakt zu Tom Avermaete hergestellt, weil er in diesem einen Jahr des Stiftungsprofessur sehr stark dieses Thema der Commons behandelt hat. Thank you very much for coming and nice to have you here.
Pleasure.
Schönen Abend.
Okay, well, thank you, Arno, for the very kind introduction and also the very kind invitation. I mean, it's a pleasure to be here. I must say, it's also a pleasure to be here in the context of the exhibition of Walter Niedermeyer, because that's, for me, let's say, the subject that is presented here in the photographs and which was already introduced by Arno is for me a very important subject, a subject that is very, very close to the theme of my talk today. Because what I would like to talk to you about today is indeed what I've called constructing the commons, and my whole talk will circle around this notion of the commons. What is the commons? And for me, the commons, and that will be the end of my talk, is another way of thinking about the architecture of the city. And I understand that there are some people who have prominent roles in urban planning departments here as well. So I hope that we can also at the end of the lecture get into some kind of a discussion, let's say, of what could this bring to the city as well. The reason why I started to focus on the commons is because I believe that in the contemporary period, let's say, we're experiencing what I would call a sort of paradigmatic shift. And by paradigmatic shift, I mean a shift in which we start to think differently about how we conceive of the commons, of the city, of the architecture of the city, how we initiate the architecture of the city. So that's one part of that paradigmatic shift. Secondly, I think that more and more we start to think differently about the resources that we have in our cities. What are the resources in our cities? So a shift in thinking about the urban resources. And last but not least, also the emergence of new types of urban spaces. So for me, these are three reasons, let's say, why I thought, okay, it's interesting to start focusing on the commons. And maybe a good way to explain that to you is by very simply looking at this project, the project of which I think that many of you will know this project, of course. It's the project by Lina Bobardi. The project it's a project in Brazil for SES Pompeia in Sao Paulo. And this is a project which was initiated not by the state, by the Brazilian state, nor by a private developer, but by a collective of urban actors. Mainly the initiative was taken by small commercial actors, you could say, the butcher, the bakery, getting together and initiating a new project for the city. So already at the level of the initiation of this urban project, this was in my mind a bit out of the ordinary. The project was a project that started from a big factory nowadays in the middle of Sao Paulo. And the question was indeed, or the main program was to create a new sort of space for public appearance, I would say, in the city of Sao Paulo. A space where the citizens of Sao Paulo could gather, could come together. This was what the factory was before, a factory of barrel making. And I think what Lina Bobardi did in a very interesting, and this is of course the plan of the factory. You recognize in the plan all of the bigger industrial buildings, let's say, and with their very sort of rational and repetitive structure. And I think what Lina Bobardi did in a very interesting way is that she, through very minimal interventions, started to lock this factory, which was previously a private space in the city, started to unlock this factory as a sort of resource for the entire city. So what did she do? Well, this is of course were just the factory grounds. She initiated a few entrance places to this old factory grounds. Before, the factory was completely walled and disconnected from the city, you could say, and she was forging entry points to this big entrance gates to the factory grounds, but also to the different factory buildings. She was adding a few simple elements, an element to make fire, an element of water, as you can see here as well, and then also sort of sturdy urban furniture, you could say, these big elements on which you can sit, lie, gather, and so on. And by introducing just these very simple elements of gates, of the elements of fire, of water, of sitting and gathering, she in some kind of way unlocked this, as I said before, private space as now a sort of collective space, or I would say common resource for the city of Sao Paulo. And indeed, this is a very successful project. For those of you who have been there, you will understand, or you will know that this is indeed a place where people gather, talk to one another, see one another, a place of public appearance, you could say. This was this part of the project that I showed until right now, but it's also a place of public performance. By adding very simple tribunes to the already existing structure, suddenly this place became a place of public performance. And it's also a place of, you could say, public or common production, let's say, not the production of barrels as before, but artistic production or creative production, you could say, in the last part of in this part of the project. And then there is this last part, which is indeed a place of common leisure, you could say, as well, where people can come, enjoy the sun as on a sort of urban beach. And if you understand that this is the factory in the very dense city of Sao Paulo, you understand that this is really a sort of new resource, let's say. One more time, a resource that was not planned by the state, not planned by a private developer, but planned and developed and now also maintained and programmed by this association of small commerciants, let's say. I think that all of us can see that this can be understood as a sort of common resource for the city. So what Lina Bobardi was doing in the beginning of the 1980s is, for me, something that becomes more and more prominent, and that also became more and more interesting to think about, okay, what happens if collectives of citizens, like these small commercial commerciants in Sao Paulo, if they take an initiative in the city, what sort of spaces do they generate? And what I will try to do today is to try to go a bit more in depth into these spaces that they generate, and I do that with the help of a new field of theory that is emerging, a field of theory that is emerging around this notion of the commons, a field of theory that actually comes from economy, from political thinking, from social geography, but I think, and that's what I'm going to try to tell to you today, that this field of theory, this field of thinking could be very, very interesting for us as architects, as urban designers and urban planners as well. So that's what I will try to show to you today. So my talk has three parts still. First, I will say a bit more about, in my mind, the interest of focusing on the commons nowadays. Secondly, I will tell you a bit and shortly about the theories of the commons that are around. And a third thing is that I will show two projects in the Netherlands, the context where I'm working, and show how this thinking of the commons indeed influences another way of, well, dealing with the city, operating in the city, you could say as well. That's the program, that's the menu card, let's say, for tonight. So first, one more time, why would it be so interesting to focus on the commons nowadays? Well, for me, I think there's a very clear reason, because we have learned to look upon the architecture of the city from these two perspectives, the two perspectives that I'm showing here. We've learned to look upon the architecture of the city as something which is the result of neoliberal initiative and investment, private developers doing the city, developing the city, transforming the city, extending the city, let's say. And another very, very dominant model of thinking about how we develop and transform the city is this one, the state. The state, and particularly in Europe, we have a very long tradition of the welfare state, planning cities, planning extensions of cities, and so on. And I think what the commons does is that it offers us an alternative. In other ways, another way of thinking, not excluding necessarily private initiative, not excluding necessarily state initiative, but thinking about other ways of developing the city in much more complex assemblages, you could say, in much more complex groups of citizens, private sector, public sector taking initiative. That's for me what the commons could bring. And this is an effect, I think, also on our thinking on what I would call the spaces of appearance and encounter. We've learned to think about the spaces of appearance and encounter in our cities as these kind of spaces, developed by private investors, shopping malls, as the new spaces where we encounter one another, or as spaces of encounter that are completely programmed and scripted by the state, as official museums, as you see here in the Centre Pompidou in Paris. I think that places like the CES Pompeia, which I just introduced to you, they add another sort of space to the city, not scripted by the market, not scripted by the state, but with a different sort of openness, exactly because of their common, their collective character, you could say. A second reason I think why it is interesting to focus on the commons is because in our cities there is a question of what I would call connectivity, let's say. This is, of course, a very extreme example of how we develop our cities nowadays as a sort of juxtaposition of different logics. That's what you see here in Mexico City, where we, of course, see that there's even a clear cut, a clear wall. This is an extreme example of Mexico, but I think that in many of our cities, and I'm showing Copenhagen here, and the new extension of Copenhagen, the so-called Eurostad, that we are thinking our cities not as something, not as an urban fabric which has connections, let's say, but something which is composed of disconnected parts. For instance, I find that when we look at this new extension of Copenhagen, at the Eurostad, that this is composed of indeed a fantastic juxtaposition of great buildings, but that it misses an idea of connectivity in the city. And I think that the commons are indeed also a way of rethinking what connectivity can mean in the city. And then the last thing that I want to mention, why I think it's necessary that we focus on the commons nowadays, because I think that the commons, they also offer us a way of thinking about what co-creation can mean in the city. Cities are made by professional actors, by urban planning officers, by architects, by urban designers, but they are also made by citizens. And I think that this thinking of the commons is indeed a way to start to think about how the city is co-produced, let's say, is a cooperation between different actors. I'm showing you a poster here of Vancouver with, I think, a very nice title. The difference between a good place and a great place is whether you helped to make it. The idea that also citizens, they co-produce the city. I've been very inspired by these kind of ways of thinking. This is J. Well Jasper, who's talking about all that we share in the city. And of course, at the right-hand side, we have the urban sociologist Richard Sennett, who's talking about the rituals, pleasures, and politics of cooperation in our cities. What can we achieve more when different actors in the city, they cooperate? Let's say that's what, in my mind, Sennett is bringing. So three good reasons to focus on the commons. It has to do with a different set of spaces of appearance, not the spaces of the market and the state. It has to do indeed also with the fact that cooperation is possible, and it has to do with connectivity in cities as well. These are, at least for me, three good reasons for focusing on these commons. Oh, sorry. But how now, and that's my second part, but how now to think about the commons and what are the commons, because this is maybe a sort of buzzword that is around. So how can we conceive of these commons? Well, these commons are, of course, a very, very rich field of theory, let's say. And what I would like to do with you is just to point to three aspects of these theories, which I think can be very important for us as architects and urban designers. I'm basing myself on the main theories of the commons. This is one of the main books on the commons by Elinor Ostrom. Elinor Ostrom is a Nobel Prize winner in economy. She introduced or reintroduced this idea of the commons in the book that I'm showing here, Governing the Commons. And on the left-hand side, I'm showing you a book of somebody who is another great thinker of the commons, Silke Helfrich, who has also been thinking a lot about what commons can mean. A third person that I just want to give you as a reference for those of you who would like to read more about what the commons are about is the Austrian-Hungarian philosopher Ivan Illich. And Ivan Illich has also been talking about the commons, and Illich is using a very nice metaphor. And I would like you to read with me very shortly this metaphor. He's talking about the metaphor of the oak tree. And he's saying an oak tree might be in the commons. So imagine the oak tree, I have it in my next slide, this kind of a tree, might be in the commons. Its shade in the summer is reserved for the shepherd and his flock. So in the shade of the oak tree, the shepherd and his flock can be. Its acorns are reserved for the pigs, that's food for the pigs. Its dry branches serve as fuel for firing. In springtime, some of the fresh branches are used as ornaments, let's say. So what Illich is doing is taking one element out of the landscape, the oak tree, and he's showing to us that this oak tree can become a resource for various citizens, let's say, for various people. That this can become what I would call a common resource. So what I will try to do today is indeed try to talk about three aspects of these commons, and I've called these three aspects with three Latin names. You could say I've called them res communis, lex communis, and praxis communis. I will do this very shortly, so bear with me a few minutes, and then you will have some idea of what is prominent in these theories of the commons. The first aspect of these theories of the commons that I want to talk about is that the commons, they are always about common pool resources that we share. And I think for us, thinking about the architecture of the city, let's say, it's a very, very strong frame of mind. We can look upon our cities as resources that we share. Let's listen for a moment to Elinor Ostrom. I don't know if I have, do I have sound on the computer or not? No, most probably not. It's not a big deal. I have it here, but I'll tell you. So the first thing that we need to keep in mind that the commons is always about resources that are shared, and I think is indeed a very interesting idea that common pool resources in cities. We can find resources. Think about maybe the water in our cities. Think about the green in our cities. Think about the open spaces in our cities as resources that we share. Let's say this is what is theory of the commons, and specifically the theories by Elinor Ostrom, what they are suggesting to us. This is another thinker about the commons, Michel Bouwens. And Michel Bouwens is in some kind of way detailing a bit this idea of common resources. He's talking about three types of common resources. Three types of common resources that we can find in our cities. He's talking about inherited common resources. Resources like water, like forests, and earth, and so on. He's talking about immaterial common resources. And immaterial common resources, you should think about cultural, knowledge that we have in our cities, skills that we have in our cities, crafts that we have in our cities. These are immaterial resources, but they can be commonly shared as well. And a third thing that he's talking about is material commons, the material resources that we have in our cities. Well, think very simply about the bricks and the stone and the slate that we have in our cities. We can look upon these material aspects of our cities, these material parts of our cities, as common resources, as resources that we share, let's say. So I think you already start to feel that it's looking through the focus of the commons can be helpful for us to think the city as well. It of course doesn't mean that the moment that we identify common resources, this doesn't mean that they are already common pool resources, that they are shared by everybody. We can identify brick in the city, or we can identify craft in the city, but that doesn't necessarily mean that these resources are shared. We need to take action, let's say. If we take, I'm very happy, of course, by having the exhibition here, because the exhibition is a great example of families that share certain resources. For instance, gardens. If you look at the exhibition, you will see that these families that have been photographed, they share common gardens. Well, in the Netherlands, we have also such a figure. In the Netherlands, we have a figure of agricultural land that is shared. This is the figure of the so-called Meent. And if you look at the Meent, this is the city of Hilversum. And this is the so-called Hilversum's Meent. If you look at the landscape, this is the city. This is the Hilversum's Meent. And still today, when we look at the city, aerial photographs of the city of Ilversum, we can recognize this big agricultural land. Agricultural land which was not privately owned, but which was owned by the community. And interestingly so, this is the Meent again. Here you see the division of the Meent, because the Meent had to be worked on, had to be cultivated, let's say. And this division was year after year reconsidered, renegotiated, let's say. So what did the farmers of Ilversum do? Here are the farmers working on the Meent. These Meents, they existed from virtually in the Middle Ages and existed until, let's say, far in the 20th century. Well, every year they gathered in a church. Here you see a sort of drawing of it, and they discussed how the Meent would be divided. So already in our landscapes, we indeed find ways of identifying the landscape as a common resource, and of indeed negotiating, let's say, the use of that. In agriculture we find it, but also if we think about cities, also in our European cities, there are many resources that are shared, let's say. One of the resources is, for instance, the resource of water. And if we look at the figure of the architectural figure, I would say, of the lavoirs in France, we can see that both in villages, as you see here, but also, of course, in cities or in towns. This idea of sharing this resource was even regulated, you can say, by an architectural figure, the architectural figure of these lavoirs. Sometimes rather simple sheds, as you can see here, and sometimes much more elaborated buildings. This is the Fosse de Dionne in Tonnerre, a very elaborated building, let's say, which is unlocking this resource of the water for the community of this town. So that washing and other activities could take place. And if you look very carefully at this historic figure, then you see here that people are washing, and that then, of course, this washing water is entering into the city. So already in our cities, if we look carefully, we see that there have been certain moments where we've identified certain resources like agricultural lands, resources like water, and that we've found sometimes very impermanent, like in domains, sometimes a bit more permanent ways of regulating and commoning these resources, of sharing these resources, let's say. So this was my first point of thinking, let's say. This idea that the commons is always about common resources that are identified and that are in impermanent or permanent ways shared, let's say. And you could see from my last examples that architecture plays a role in that. The second aspect that I would like to talk about is what I've called lex communis. And lex communis refers to the laws, the codes, the norms, let's say. The codes and conventions of the commons, I've called that as well. Because one of the things that Elinor Ostrom learns us when she's talking about the commons is that she's saying, without rules of control, there are no commons. So, in other words, we can identify the water as a resource in our cities. We can say, okay, this is a common resource, but Ostrom is telling us we always need codes and norms in order to let's say, regulate. She's saying, without rules to control entry, a common pool resource becomes an open access resource, which is subjected to unrestrained exploitation. That's what she's saying to us. And this is what people like Ostrom, but also Garrett Hardin, call the tragedy of the commons. If you look with me for a little moment to this cartoon, this is one of these agricultural commons, and they've decided that all the cows of the farmers of the community can use this agricultural land. And what happens then is that more and more people are going to use this agricultural land. More and more cows enter this agricultural land until the tragedy, the resource is exploited, is finished, let's say. So what Ostrom is saying to us, and I will bring that in a moment to architecture as well, when we think about the commons, we should think, one, about these common resources, but secondly, we should also think about codes and rules in order to control these resources. This example from Garrett Hardin is, of course, an example from the agricultural world, let's say, but actually, and maybe an old example, but actually in our contemporary cities, we have also examples of resources that are exploited, and this is maybe one resource that you might all know. Do you know what I'm showing to you here? This is the website of Airbnb. Airbnb, of course, started with a beautiful idea. I have an extra room in my house. Why don't I share this with people visiting the city? Why don't I make this part of the common pool resources of the city? You could say as well. This sort of idea, or somebody is coming over and incidentally I'm going to, let's say, offer that room to somebody coming over and even having a big, a small reward, economic reward for it. But what has happened, of course, is that in cities like Amsterdam, I'm showing you Amsterdam here, this has become a completely overused and overexploited common resource, you could say. This is a map of the city of Amsterdam. The blue points are the hotels in the city center of Amsterdam, and the orange points are all of the Airbnb rooms. So this has become not a common pool resource, but a privatized resource, a market resource, you could say right now. And that's why Elinor Ostrom is saying we need codes and conventions, we need rules to protect these common resources, let's say. For instance, in Amsterdam, the Airbnb rooms in the city center of Amsterdam, in 2016 you had 20,000 Airbnb rooms. Just to tell you that this idea of the tragedy of the commons is something that we're experiencing nowadays in many cities as well. And I think Airbnb is an example of that. This is a shot from a documentary where this person is living permanently in a house. This room is rented out constantly as a hotel room, let's say, and of course causing a lot of problems, and in the end pushing these kind of people out of the city center of Amsterdam. So that's why Ostrom, and I'm not going to read them all, that's why Ostrom is making a plea to, when we think about the commons, also to keep in mind a certain set of rules, a certain set of codes, let's say, in order to share the resources in a good way. And Ostrom is also giving a few examples, and this is one of the examples that she's given, and these are the irrigation systems. The irrigation systems in the vicinity of Valencia, of the city of Valencia in Spain. A very, very arid region in principle, very dry region, but where indeed a whole system of irrigation was set up, not by the state, but by the farmers living in this region. Here you see the main canals. This was the river which had always been there. These were these arid zones, and here you see the main canals. And then there's a very, very fine-grained system of canals which were built by the farmers themselves. And here you see some of these canals, turning this whole zone from an arid zone into a very, very fertile and green zone. That's what you see on the maps here. This is Valencia. This is now this irrigated and fertile zone. But the important thing is that in order to, let's say, irrigate these lands, that the whole system of rules were set up. And this system of rules was on the one hand rules of negotiation, and that's what you see here. This is the Cathedral of Valencia, where some of the representatives of the farmers of these irrigated zones, they gather and they discuss. And there's even a special little architectural space, let's say, for their 2 weekly discussions. So the representatives of the farmers, they come there and they discuss how will we share the resource. So this is about negotiating, talking, and so on. And then, of course, there is a second system of rules, and that system of rules is in some kind of way embedded in the architecture of the irrigation canals. The architecture of the irrigation canals is very, very sophisticated, a very sophisticated system of locks, of smaller and bigger canals, which in some kind of way regulates, you could say, the use of this resource, of this water resource as well. Very, very sophisticated system in order to irrigate these lands. So again, I mean, this is an example that Ostrom is giving, and what I find very interesting in this example is that there is a resource, the resource of water. This resource is in the area of Valencia scarce, and these farmers in this area, they've set up 2 systems of rules, you could say. One system of rule which is about negotiating in front of the Cathedral of Valencia, and the other one is embedded in the architecture of the irrigation of the irrigation system. These are 2 ways of controlling, let's say, that these resources, the resource of water, remains a common resource and is of use for the whole community, you could say. There are other examples as well. This is, for instance, another example, a bit more of an urban example, which is the engineers of the Pont et Chaussée in France, where they use, indeed, again, a whole system of rules, a whole system of codes, let's say, to deal with the open spaces of the city. the open spaces of the city which are open to the air, as you can see here. In other words, the streets and the squares, let's say, not designing them as a big project, but defining rules of how these streets and these avenues should be defined. So these are the open spaces. And these are the covered spaces, the markets and these spaces where people gather in the city, which were also in some kind of way, let's say, defined through sets of codes, norms, and rules. I'll go a bit quicker here. So this was the second point of my triangle. So I've talked right now on the one hand about these resources. The commons is about resources. Secondly, I said, well, the commons is also about setting up rules, codes and conventions for sharing these resources. And the last thing that I want to talk about is really about the praxis communes, the common practices, because the commons is also about doing things together, or as Richard Sennett is calling that, the pleasures, politics, and rituals of commoning, of cooperation, let's say. So in this thinking about the commons, the fact that when we think about the city, when we think about agricultural communities, that collaborating is a very important aspect, let's say. Acts of mutual support, of negotiation, of communication, and of experimentation, they are very important in thinking about these commons. And I dare to say, without knowing a lot about the communities that you've been photographing, that also in these communities, I'm sure that structures of support, of collaboration are very important. So that's very fundamental in these theories about the commons as well. Many thinkers about the commons, they are saying that, well, these actions of collaboration and cooperations, they are also part of finding an alternative for purely the state intervention or purely the market intervention. Try to read this quote shortly with me. Rather than to look at the state authorities as guarantors or administrators of their interests, commoners generally prefer to seek sovereignty and control over spheres of life that matter to them, their cities, their neighborhoods. So that is very typical for this thinking about the commons, that the initiative about your own living environment, about your own neighborhood is not left to others, but that you, as a citizen, you also take initiative. You're part of this venture, let's say. Also, when we look at the history of architecture, we have several, let's say, experiments with that. And I'm taking you right now to the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century to the UK. This is Patrick Geddes. And Patrick Geddes was one of these people who also strongly believed that the city was not only made by officials, not only made by private developers, but was made by the citizens. And he was looking at the city, here is Patrick Geddes, and he was looking at the city of Edinburgh, a city that was at the time when he was investigating late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, a city that was very struck by poverty, bad living conditions. And what he did, he worked together with groups of citizens and he surveyed this city. So the survey was not only done by professionals, but was done by people living in the city on an everyday basis, let's say. So they went into the city and they made these kind of maps. They looked at open spaces that were sometimes in the interior of blocks, a bit hidden, unreachable, these kind of spaces, and they identified these spaces as possible resources to the city, let's say. So they made maps of these kind of spaces. At the time, nobody really thought that these spaces were really valuable, but the people living there, the citizens practicing these spaces there, could see, well, this could be a great place to live, or maybe to cultivate, or to play for the children, something like that. And they made these kind of maps in which they identified all of the green spaces that you saw, sometimes in the interiors of blocks, as possible new public spaces, as they called it. So, and then they made, let's say, rudimentary plans for how to unlock these found resources, let's say, as common resources for the city. Sometimes this unlocking had to do with creating a little stair element, a little element that would give access to these places that were a bit difficult to access previously. And here you see some of these stair elements being constructed by the citizens, and in that sense unlocking these spaces in the interiors of blocks as spaces that now could be used by the community, by the whole community, let's say. Sometimes using these spaces for production, for growing vegetables, let's say. Making these kind of shifts, as you can see. This is of course the initial state, this is what they were imagining. And then here you see, indeed, sometimes indeed using these as gardens, as a sort of community gardens. But the point that I want to get across is that the identification of these community gardens, the identification of these resources was the result of a common practice of people, citizens working together, and by the knowledge that they have, by their everyday knowledge that they have of the city, identifying where the important resources would be. Another example is this example, but I think I'll just skip that for now. Sorry. So what I did right now, because I need to remain a bit compact, I can see, is that I talked about three aspects of these commons. I talked about the common resources as something very important. I talked about the codes and conventions in order to protect these resources. And I talked about the fact that the commons is always about jointly, cooperatively, let's say, generating knowledge, identifying resources, even taking care and cultivating these resources as well. That's what we saw in the example of Geddes. And what I would like to do right now is show that this is not only about history or about architecture or traditional examples, but that I have the feeling that young architectural offices, or not young architectural offices, collectives of architectural offices, citizens, state offices, private developers, they are using these kind of approaches in contemporary projects for cities. And I will show two projects. One project which is a project for Amsterdam, and the second project is a project for Rotterdam. So two main cities in the Netherlands where I believe that these ideas of the commons are activated. I think that the first project that I'm going to show is very interesting for you to reflect upon how do we formulate a project for the city. And the first project that I want to talk about is really, let's say, located at a very, very prime location in the city of Amsterdam. For those of you who know Amsterdam, the old city of Amsterdam is at the left corner. It would be situated somewhere here. This is, of course, the big I, the big river. And this is what we call Amsterdam North. It's at the other side of the historical city of Amsterdam, but still very close to the city center. An area which used to be, as you can see, a former industrial area, actually where shipbuilding and the alike activities were going on. But an area that was also very, very polluted. An area that was polluted, and this area became vacant in 2008. In 2008, of course, when the economical crisis hit the cities in the Netherlands very, very hard. And the normal ways of thinking about the city by the state or by the market didn't work any longer. Normally, what would have happened in these kind of areas was that the urban planning office of Amsterdam, they would have found a private developer, and together they would have developed this site. At the time, in 2008, it was too expensive. The site was highly polluted. It was too expensive to rinse the site, to transform the site, and thus what the city of Amsterdam did is that they launched a competition, an ideas competition. What could we do at this particular site? A site, as you can see, which was quite beautifully located next to two canals, let's call them, very nicely, a very nice site. Here we see it a bit more in detail. This is the old city of Amsterdam. This is the IJ, the big river, and we are located exactly here. And here you see the site a bit more in detail. And what happened there is that indeed there was another way of formulating what an urban project could be. For an urban project formulated by a collaborative and a cooperation of different urban actors. Urban actors that were architects, urban designers, engineers, landscape architects, citizens associations, enlightened private developers, all working together and formulating an alternative project for this particular site. Here you see some of them working on the site. I've named some of their names in the bottom for those of you who are interested in it. But I think the main interest is that they looked at this site, which was considered by everybody as a polluted site of no value, that they looked at this site as a resource, as a possible resource, a resource that could become a common resource, let's say, because they said they divided the site in two patches, let's say, in two fields, as it were, and they said, well, this polluted site we can look upon as a resource for the city. And what we will do is rinse this site. We will not follow the temporality of a normal urban project where you say, okay, we start right now, and in 3 years this little site will be developed. But we will look upon the project in a much longer perspective, in a much longer time perspective, a perspective of 10 to 20 years. And what will happen is that we will rinse this site through using the landscape, using landscape elements. So this zone, which was by everybody considered as a no resource, a polluted resource, was now recognized as a promising future resource, you could say, because of looking at this site as a big landscape, a landscape that would get the time to purify itself over a time period from 10 to 20 years. And that's for those of you who are knowledgeable. I'm not that knowledgeable in landscape design, but you see that there was quite a sophisticated understanding of which plans could in some kind of way turn this site into a full-fledged resource. And then they discovered another sort of resource, I would say, in the city of Amsterdam. As most probably all of you know, many people are living on living boats in the Netherlands, and they discovered this also as a resource that would help them to inhabit the site, to come up with a sort of alternative way of inhabiting this site. And as you can see, what is happening here is that these boats, they are no longer used only on the water, but also on the site, let's say, because the site was so polluted that you couldn't step on the site. The boats were found as a resource to purify the landscape, but meanwhile inhabit the site. So this is the idea. The boats, which are, let's say, freely available in the city of Amsterdam, they are placed on the site to, in some kind of way, create a new sort of allotment, you could say. Collective services are added to this site, and as you can see, a sort of boardwalk in between the boats, because you couldn't touch the site, you couldn't stand on the site, as it were. And the idea is that after 10 to 20 years, the boats will disappear again, and the site will be indeed a sort of purified resource for the city as large. But the site is not only a purified resource for the city at large after 15, 20 years, let's say, but it will also be, let's say, a resource for the city right now, meanwhile. So what they did is indeed that they developed a new idea of an allotment. The boats were turned into creative spaces, and some of them also in living spaces, let's say. And this was developed. And here you see the site with the boats, these housing boats, which were placed in a rather dense configuration on the site. The boats themselves, as a resource, they are also upgraded while they are on the site. But the most important thing is that these boats, together they started to create a new sort of environment, you can say, an environment which is this indeed a breeding place for young creative talent, and thus gets people there. But more importantly, maybe an environment that also became a center in the city of Amsterdam, not only for the people working there, but for the much broader neighborhood of Amsterdam North. So nowadays, this is how the place looks in the weekends. This is really a place where people want to come, people want to enjoy, let's say, this resource, and people want to, well, in leisurely ways, but also in creative ways, want to use this neighborhood now, this new little neighborhood in the city center of Amsterdam. What I'm trying to convey, this is of course a small project, but I think it's a project which shows us, maybe at a very small scale and maybe at a very funny and compact scale, shows us that it's possible to think about certain areas in the city from a different sort of perspective. A perspective indeed that values indeed common resources, let's say. Indeed decide turning it not into a private development, but in a resource that can be more openly and more commonly used. That values also common practices, and that also starts from a set of common codes. So that's what I try to show here to you. The second project that I want to show to you is a project from the city of Rotterdam. And now I'm going to take you to the very, very city center of Rotterdam. This is again, for those of you who know Rotterdam, we are looking here at the main station of Rotterdam. The canopy that you see here, these are the railroad tracks. This is the main station. So we are right in the very, very city center of Rotterdam. And I'm going to talk to you mainly about this block and the extension of this block. This was, of course, a block which was as developers called it, a prime A location. I mean, right next to the central station, so well reachable with Thalys, with all of the national trains in the Netherlands and so on. And the idea was, again, until 2008, to turn this into a very, very dense block of offices, hotels, casinos. This was the future vision for this block. And then again, some people, the rents were already stopped for those companies who were using this block. The rents were already stopped. And then in 2008, the crisis hit. And this normal way of developing, of thinking about this location as a place for top offices, for big casinos, for big hotels, didn't work any longer. And also the city of Rotterdam had to rely on other logics, let's say. And so what they were doing, a bit like in Amsterdam, is that they again launched a sort of ideas competition. What should we do with this location? This block was already half empty, very prime location in Rotterdam. And what they did is that they launched this idea competition. And indeed, again, a group of actors, of urban actors, an architecture office called ZUS, but also private developers, citizens associations, but also the local city office of Rotterdam. They all gathered and they came up with a different sort of project. A different sort of project for this location, so not developing this block at once into a new block of casinos, hotels and prime office spaces, but a different sort of logic of developing this prime A urban area of Rotterdam. And this is the whole project, and I will tell a bit more about that in a moment. This is the central station of Rotterdam. Previously we were standing here and the picture was looking in that direction. This is the block that I was talking about, and this project became a project that reached even far beyond the block. And what were in my mind let's say the logics that this project followed? First of all, what this project did is that it established a sort of lex communis, let's say. It was starting to look upon this prime A location in Rotterdam, not as a site for private development, but as a resource that could be shared. A resource that could be shared by several initiatives, let's say. So what did they do? defined a set of principles in which several urban actors could work with, and this set of principles was mainly taking form by a path and a color. The color, as you can see, was the color yellow. That's what they decided upon. We are going to use throughout this project the color yellow. That's the main marker, let's say. And they defined the path. One more time, this is the central station. Here you see the first part of the path. The path would be extended across the block, across streets, and would be eventually extended into various urban neighborhoods of Rotterdam. So this path was a path sometimes very simple, the color on the already existing street and the existing pavement, just indicating, let's say, a route, an urban route. Sometimes it was going through certain existing buildings, as you can see here. Sometimes it was using a little piece of an existing parking lot in order to continue this connection in the city. Sometimes a little element like this wooden stair became part of this path and this color. Sometimes it became a bit more heavy. It became a bridge, a pedestrian bridge, and so a stair, as you can see here, and so on and so forth. So extending this idea of a color and a path, let's say, as the main driver of urban development. One more time, I mean, we are in the very, very center of Rotterdam here. This is, of course, a very, very fragile strategy, you could say, but nevertheless, it has turned out to be a powerful strategy as well. So the first thing that they did is that they said, very simply, we define the path, and along this path, things can happen, or along and on the path, things can happen. The second thing that they did is that they started to identify what are the common resources along this path, let's say. What are the common resources in the city? And what they did is indeed that they identified sometimes these kind of spaces, a space which was formerly a sort of hallway of a building, and reclaimed these spaces as common spaces, let's say. Of course, you can imagine that the fact that the city authorities were part of the project here was, of course, very important to reclaim these spaces as well. So, understanding that these kind of spaces, they were of prime importance. Here you can see this little space. It's a very, very little sort of hallway, which was previously a private hallway, now turned into a common resource for the city, let's say. And by that, making a connection between the main station of Rotterdam and the rest of the city, a connection that didn't exist before. Or, as I was already saying, recognizing that a little part of a parking lot can become a very important urban path, let's say, a common urban path. Or this stair that I was already talking about, and when we are on top of this stair, indeed, that a simple hallway of a building can also turn into a common space. So what you are seeing here was previously a private lobby, let's say, of a building, now turned into a common space, which is open virtually 24 hours a day, and indeed makes the possibility to connect the inner part of the block, go through it, and then of course extend to the rest of the city. Or recognizing that next to the path there were these kind of zones that were indeed sort of leftover zones, where there were just some garbage cans and some cars parked, let's say, and recognizing that these zones could become very important resources for the city as well. Here you see the stair, and then you see that these kind of zones, but also these kind of zones, which were previously a sort of leftover zones next to the city, they were now turned into green resources, parks, we could say, for these urban neighborhoods of Rotterdam, which was much needed, because this is a rather dense area of Rotterdam. So indeed, these kind of zones, previously no man's land, now turned into zones that are well of importance, are common resources for the city at large. And then, so that's what I showed right here. This is the park, of course. So recognizing that this could be turned into a common resource as well, and then recognizing the possibility that when they reached out over the railway, there was another resource, an old station, an old elevated station that could be turned into a common resource as well. It's this part, so we started here, this is the extension, this is the new park, let's say, and then recognizing when we're bridging the railway, there's something else there, an old station that looked like this, was not used for decades, let's say, and now was turned into a common resource for leisurely activity. So not for not like a park, but more for performances and so on. So indeed, several let's say projects were made for that, and in the end, this was made indeed for all kinds of festive performances, circus performances, these kind of sports performances, but also for cinema, as you can see as well. So bit by bit, extending this path, and always discovering new resources for the city. Resources that previously belonged to the railways, resources that previously belonged to private actors, and trying to reclaim them, trying to show that by making a simple extension, these could become resources for the whole city, let's say. So this is this idea of starting from the codes and then discovering along the codes, along these paths, a variety of urban resources. One more, so I already explained the park here, I explained this, and now I'm going to take you to the roofs of these buildings as well, which were also reclaimed as common resources, as a sort of urban acres, as they've called them, where you indeed could cultivate in the middle of Rotterdam vegetables suddenly as well. Just to tell you, I mean, of course, this comes with a lot of negotiations and with a lot of particular actions, but just to tell you how different this project was. So I've already talked about the Lex Communes, the common codes, the paths and the yellow color, let's say. I've talked about discovering the resources or reclaiming certain places as common resources for the city. And now the last thing that I want to talk about is indeed this praxis communes. How in this project was working together, cooperation organized. And there I think we see several ways of cooperating. On the one hand, of course, what they did in this project is that they constantly gathered all of these groups that were taking initiatives when parts of the project were realized. The project was realized in different phases, and when one phase was realized, there was always this kind of party, let's call it. So the pleasures of talking to one another, of making this project part of celebrating that this project is a common project. So this was one strategy of commoning. A second strategy of commoning is that they also used the skills and the knowledge of the people in order to realize certain parts of the project. I'm showing you here the park. Do you remember that I said, okay, they rediscovered certain resources and turned them into a park? Well, this park was not as normally would have done. Normally what would have happened in Rotterdam, the city would have commissioned a big gardening company and they would have come and made the park. Here, a different sort of strategy was followed, and the knowledge and the labor of the citizens was used in order to construct the park. So what did they do? You need to read this as dates. This is the 30th of May, the 31st of May, the 1st of June, the 2nd of June, the 3rd of June, and so on. So the park was literally constructed with the citizens. So how did this happen? A sort of basic grid was set, and then bit by bit this park was constructed with the citizens. So here you see a sort of initial stage, you see the grid, you see already some of the citizens present here to start working, and then bit by bit the park was planted and was constructed. The park is still there if you want to go and see, and it's still maintained by a citizens association at this moment as well. That's how the park is looking here. You see it in a bit more elaborate form. And then the last way of common practices, let's say, of praxis communis, was also that the whole project was co-financed. So it was not only about co-working, as in the previous example, but the whole project was co-financed. And there a very, very smart, you could say, strategy was used. You could indeed buy in some kind of way little parts of the part. As you can see here, you could buy just a single strip of the part. You could buy a section. You could buy literally a whole part. And well, several prices were aligned to that. And as you can see here, the moment that they were here in the project extended from the internal block to the rest of the city, and more. Well, big parts of, let's say, the building costs, they were generated through co-financing. Private persons were co-financing, associations of citizens living in these neighborhoods and who now had an interest of having a fast access to the central station of Rotterdam, they were co-financing. Institutions were co-financing as well. And this is how they were represented, let's say. The part that you co-financed, your name or your slogan was in some kind of way represented on that. And in the end, well, this became a full-fledged project connecting 1, 2, 3 big neighborhoods in the very, very city center of Rotterdam, and functioning, I think, in a quite successful way. This brings me indeed to the end of what I wanted to convey to you today. And just to summarize, what I've tried to convey to you is that I think that this thinking of the commons, as illustrated in these two projects, in these two last projects, by focusing on common codes on the one hand, or thinking an urban project in terms of common codes, by identifying certain resources in the city as common resources or even reclaiming them as common resources. And last but not least, also thinking an urban project to common practices, be it festive practices, be it cooperation, so labor practices, but also indeed co-financing as one of these common practices. I think that what has been happening in Amsterdam and in Rotterdam is indeed propelling us into a new way of thinking about how we can develop our cities. I'm of course not pretending that this is the solution for all cities, but I think that it does show that we can start to think differently about our cities, as indeed this combination of common codes, common resources and common practices, leading in my mind to projects that are very promising and that show us indeed a future way of thinking about this architecture of the city. Thanks.
Okay. A few months ago, I was in Rotterdam, and I visited this project, and I heard that the building, it was a building for artists, architects, and startup companies, but they have to leave. Is it right?
Yeah. Well, that's of course, we were already discussing prior to my presentation as well. What is rather interesting and what I think I try to tell to you is that this new way of looking at the architecture of the city emerged at the moment when there was a crisis, let's say. The normal ways of developing the city didn't work any longer, I would say. And now, of course, the crisis, at least in the Netherlands, is over. I mean, there's a lot of activity in the building industry, and what does remain the question is what remains of these initiatives, let's say. And indeed, so this block, the so-called ski block, this is called the ski block. This is now inhabited at this moment by young startups, let's say, because it was also relatively cheap to be there as well. But of course, that's maybe a bit the flip side of the project, that this project is now shown or underlined how important this location is and how central this location is. And now indeed there are thoughts, let's say, of saying, okay, now this project is over and we are going to develop this much more in a sort of conventional way again. So that's a bit of a pity, I find personally. But nevertheless, I think that the project stands as a way of making us think about the architecture of the city in a different way, let's say. But the chance is indeed rather big that at least this part of the project will be turned into a more conventional urban project again.
And the second question is the project in Amsterdam. You said in your lecture every project needs notes. What kind of notes was written or script in this project? Because it was only the development of.
Yeah, I didn't say. Yeah, in this project, I don't know if I should go back. Most probably I shouldn't too, because there are too many slides. But in the project in Amsterdam, there were also a set of codes, let's say, and these codes they were about, for instance. There was a certain amount of boats that can be on the site, but the boats are also being upgraded. That means extended in some cases as well. So they've set all kinds of rules, let's say, in order to make this new sort of allotment still livable and possible, let's say. So the notes or the codes, so there is a set of strategies. It's like a manual, let's say, which has been developed of how you can upgrade your housing boats, but of course it shouldn't go beyond the common interest as it were as well, and that's solidified. I didn't talk about that. You're right, but that's solidified in a sort of manual, you could say, and also that's maybe also good to say that some of the architectural offices which were involved in this project in Amsterdam, they still function as a sort of stewards, let's say, of the project. So whenever, let's say, adaptations or transformations are done, the people of Space and Matter in this, the architectural office of Space and Matter, they function as stewards of the project, so they are like advisors, you could say as well, keeping the manual in mind and in some kind of way negotiating with the various users of the site to allow the necessary transformations.
But the owner of the landscape is the public, or?
Yeah, no. The part of the deal was that they also had to buy the site. So when they made a proposal, there are many aspects that I didn't talk about, and of course they are all very important. But I mean, I tried to say in an hour what I could say. So what they did is that the proposal was not only a proposal for developing the site, but was also a financial proposal. So they had to buy the site, and part of their idea is that eventually they could, if they wanted to, resell the site after these 15 to 20 years. So again, this is not the normal. Let's say, span that a banker or a developer would think about. It's a much longer span, and the turnover is a long turnover. But there is somewhere the idea that this could be resold, let's say. So they had to do everything. They had to buy the site, they had to develop the site, they need to maintain the site. That's all part of the proposal that they made. So. Clean the site, inhabit the site is all part of this proposal, and that's why I also said in the lecture it's a new way of thinking about what an urban project can be in my mind. Although, of course, I understand that these are little laboratory experiments. I will never say that this is something that we need to start doing at large scale immediately. But I think as laboratory experiments, they offer us ways of thinking about, what the development of the city could be in different sort of collectives with different sort of concerns, let's say as well, I would argue. Huh?
But in this project, maybe there's a danger because it reminds me a little bit to not non-architectural projects like in London or in New York, where owners of a part of the city without a social and responsibility, and they give the flats to artists, and after a while it's going up, and then you have to leave, and change the...
Yeah, this is of course, how to say, I mean, a sort of ever-returning issue when you're dealing with the city, that the moment that you intervene in the city and you make the city better, that the chance is very, very large that is being recuperated by the market. Let's say that's a very that's a story which is continuously going on. Let's say it's related to ideas about gentrification and so on, but we're not going to go there. But what we could say is that, for instance, in the project in Amsterdam, the fact that the collectivity is also the owner of the site is, of course, preventing that a bit. You could say, because the site is owned by the collective. So it's them who's going to decide if they're going to sell or not, if they're going to continue or not. This is a bit different here. Here there are certain parts which are not owned but leased by the collective. This is leased by the collective, for instance. That's sort of short-term rent, let's say. I think this is also leased by the collective, given by the railways to the collective as well. So in these kind of projects, it's a bit varied, you could say. But it's true, there is a certain kind of vulnerability to it. In terms of the architectural qualities, I must say that's why I talked about the codes and conventions in the beginning, because I think that there is, of course, a certain kind of architectural quality to it, which has to do with the color, which has to do with the particular shape of this part. But of course, you're right. It's very, very minimal. You could say as well. And there is a lot of openness in terms of the quality of the interventions, let's say. But I think the quality of the intervention here is really about making these urban connections, let's say, and that's really something quite fascinating, because that's really something which emerged from this project. Previously, when people were living here, they had to do like a big detour, go through these infrastructures and go in that way to the central station, or do this and then take, well, a big loop. And now there are all of these sort of shortcuts, which at least feels that, for instance, these urban areas, they are much more connected, part of the center right now than previously. So that's, I think, rather interesting. And as said, I think these processes of co-producing these spaces, they also, of course, have created a certain attachment of the people living in these areas to these spaces as well. That goes for several of the parts of these projects. So, well, it's in that sense, I think. There are many layers, of course, to these kind of projects, obviously.
I have just two admin questions. Since it's quite a huge area, do you know how many members this collective has?
It depends what you call members. The collective is let's say, composed of, let's call it them associations. I mean, there are architectural offices, there are engineering offices, there are several citizens associations. There's an association which has to do with the agriculture, the urban agriculture. So it's what should I say? It's maybe between 15 and 20 even, I think. Let's say 15, around 15 different partners, let's call them, which are all sort of groups of people. So all in all, there will be much more, obviously. Yeah.
And then the second question, as soon as you lease something, you have to be a legal body.
Yeah.
So what's the legal body of the community?
Yeah, that's a very good question. There, I think there was what they call in the Netherlands a sort of local development office. This is the city office. So the city, you have a city, the city of Rotterdam, and the city of Rotterdam has several local development offices which are related to certain neighborhoods, let's say. And this neighborhood, this neighborhood development office, let's say, they've started indeed the format of an association, and in these associations, all of these other associations are represented, let's say. So the legal body is an association, and the city has been very, very important to well, offer all kinds of opportunities to this association, I should say as well. The city has supported a bit financially, but also the city has been very important in playing a role, for instance, in making what I showed here, in some kind of way reclaiming certain spaces as common spaces as well. For instance, also the railway company is represented in that association as well, because they were, of course, very important for these zones and for this, and even for this as well. So the format, the legal body is an association in which different other associations are represented.
Did you show us that the market produce a kind of city that is not very comfortable to live in? The state is too weak to help us to have a good city. And then there are sometimes moments or situations that are people gathered together to and they are lucky in that moment to have an idea to find something. The market is so strong and the price of the square meter so high that normally that projects are not possible. This could be a project of the state, but the state can't do it. So there are some people they're inspired enough to do it. Yeah.
I think I of course generally I think it's a very good typification of what is happening here. What we shouldn't forget, and that's very important in this thinking about the commons, I can tell much more about it, is that the commons, most of the thinkers about the commons, they say the commons is beyond state and market, but beyond state and market doesn't mean excluding the state and the market. That's why I was already putting so much stress on the local state office, if you want to, the city government of Rotterdam. The local office of the city government played an important role. There were also, some parts were also financed by, let's say, private investors, but it's not the state and in the market in their former capacities, let's say. The state has, in the Netherlands, for instance, there's a very big tradition of the state planning, whole cities, let's say, at once. The big post-war urban extensions, one big plan, hubs, and the state is rolling the new city over the territory. Here the state and the market are still until a certain extent present, but in a very, very different format, let's say, and counterbalanced by other sort of urban actors. And that's, I think, for me at least, the main aspect, that the fact that the state and said, normally what the city of Rotterdam, I've seen there are plans for that. Actually, I should also include them in the lecture. There were plans for this block. Literally, this was just the state going to one of the big Dutch developers and saying, please develop this block. And this developer said, fantastic, we do, because it's next to the central station, a few big hotels, we do a casino, we do prime location offices, done. This part of Rotterdam is developed. There was a colleague of mine in Delft was already drawing the plans for that. Then 2008 hit, and so they had to find another way of developing, but that didn't mean that the state and the private developers, they completely disappeared. They were there, but in a different sort of capacity, not in this old way of doing any longer, counterbalanced by other urban actors, by citizens associations, by these people who are interested in urban agriculture, by, these sort of other actors, they came to counterbalance, and I think therefore, of course, it became a different sort of urban project. This is a big project, one more time, in a center location of one of the biggest cities in the Netherlands, but developed according to different logics, as you were saying, because there were inspired people of these different neighborhoods who had, interest, inspired young creative officers who felt that would be a challenge to find another way of developing the city as well. Maybe I start to sound too positive right now because I feel that I'm becoming a bit of a promoter of this, and there are of course many flip sides to these kind of processes as well. But I think it's inspiring, as you can hear most probably from the way that I'm talking about it. Yeah. Yes.
Would you have a proposal of how to promote that kind of commons idea in planning and city development without waiting for the next economic crisis to hit?
That's a very good question. Of course, I have many ideas on this. What I'm showing right now, I'm doing research on the commons and its importance for the architecture of the city for, I think now, 3 full years. And well, there are of course, I mean, as said here, let's say the point of departure was the crisis, because in the Netherlands, well, building industry was going very well, and the cities were being developed, and so the crisis was the point of standstill. But of course, this doesn't mean that you can't initiate these kind of processes in moments of so-called non-crisis, let's say in between brackets. That's why I think that we should keep these projects in mind as well, because already, as was said by Arno in the beginning, already the market is taking over again. But I do think that as city departments, as I understand, you can initiate these kind of projects. There's in my mind no problem in doing that. Essential is, and that's maybe going back to the previous question, essential is the composition of the in my mind of the starting team. I think that's really the essential change that I see. I mean, all of these projects, they started on a completely different basis than previously. Previously it was, wow, we have a fantastic piece of land here, let's get the highest real estate return from that. But of course, the highest real estate return is doesn't necessarily equals the highest common interest, let's say. And I think that's really the challenge that we have in front of us. But well, I was skipping over some of the examples, the more historical examples. But I think even from some historical examples, like the way that Paris was developed by these engineers of the Pont Chaussée, we can learn. For the contemporary city as well. I'm quite convinced about that. But I think indeed everything starts with let's say the initial team. I think that's really the initial, and by team I mean the initial group of urban actors that is taking the initiative, that starts to analyze the site, that starts to recognize certain resources. I think that, in my mind at least, that's a very important aspect. At least that's what I see as a very big difference between the previous projects for these kind of sites and these kind of projects. I don't know. It's not really an answer, but.
But in a way, it's another way of developing the city. So in collaboration with, and you use the knowledge and of normal people, And
this has to do also with 2 processes. This has to do with having trust on the capacity on let's say the intellectual resources and the skills that are present in a city. Very often, city planning departments have had the idea, we have the skills and the rest is unknowledgeable, let's say. And what these kind of projects are doing is that they are activating the knowledge as a resource in the city, let's say. So they are activating that, they are unlocking that, let's say. Suddenly, citizens associations, they can give an input. Suddenly, very young officers who maybe don't have any experience in planning the city, they can make their bit. So that's one thing. But so it's a bit of I think it requires a bit of trust in the resources that the city has, also the intellectual resources, the craft resources, the resources of analyzing the city and identifying these these important qualities in the city as well. And that most probably means that all parties, so city planning departments, but also citizens, they need to unlearn a bit, unlearn the previous ways of doing, let's say. So, but this idea of trust is very, very important, I think as well.
Since Arno was already mentioning the time frame or the time period when it happens and what happens afterwards, gentrification, etc. So can you tell something about Edinburgh? Because this is quite an old project. Yeah. So what happened with this public space? Yeah. Is it now, since the value raised, is it now developed, etc., etc.?
Yeah. So the question is about this project of Patrick Geddes in Edinburgh. That's what you are asking. This was, of course, I must admit, a limited moment in time. This was the late 19th century, the 1890s, and the beginning of the 20th century, that Patrick Geddes, he was working in Edinburgh in what he called the Outlook Tower. And the idea of the Outlook Tower was that in order to generate knowledge about the city, I can come as an expert, but we can also use the knowledge that citizens have. The knowledge, but also the capacities that citizens have to intervene themselves and to maintain the city, let's say, as well. So what he was doing was, on the one hand, a big sort of survey. Geddes invented the idea of what he called Civic Survey. When we want to survey the city, we can do that by using the civic resources that are there, so the citizens and the knowledge that they have, the everyday knowledge. And this was quite successful because they were able to identify a whole set of spaces that weren't considered valuable by the experts before, let's say, but now suddenly became very, very valuable everyday spaces for playing, for cultivating, for leisure, let's say. And then they were making sort of, well, very rudimentary designs. The designs, they were most of the time limited to, let's say, creating access to these spaces, because Edinburgh has a rather rough topography, let's say. So it was about creating access to these spaces so that these spaces could be used. Some of these spaces, they are still there. They are still used. Other spaces disappeared and were, well, later on developed, because, of course, this was indeed, as at the beginning of the 20th century, the last interventions. And this, but what is interesting as well is that Geddes was also very much aware of the fact that it's not only about identifying and creating these points of access, but it's also about maintaining. So taking care, in the thinking of the commons, caretaking is very, very important. So for instance, in this park, in park, or well, it's a little park, let's call it, in Rotterdam, there is still a citizens association who's taking care of it. So that's also very important and very interesting, that this caretaking is a very important. Resources need to be taken care of. Let's say. So, well, I hope that I gave some kind of an answer. So some of the spaces, they are still there. They became like official public spaces. Let's say. Others, they disappeared and they became part of urban redevelopment. So that's a bit. Well, yeah, I think that's. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for your lecture.
Thank you.